Okay, let's get started. So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for the fourth installment of our Grief Matters Ended Beginnings webinar series. My name is Colleen Risk, and I am one of the bereavement coordinators with Hospice Simcoe, as well as the host for this evening. My pronouns are she, her. So I'd like to, thank you for joining us this evening. And part of my role with hospice is overseeing our Ended Beginnings program, which focuses on supporting individuals who are bereaved due to a pregnancy and infant loss. So if after the webinar this evening, if you have any questions about the program, or if you are feeling you would like to reach out for support, please feel free to contact our community support office at 705-725-1140. So tonight's webinar, we are going to be joined by the wonderful Lisa and Megan from the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Network, or some of you may know it as PAIL, and they are based out of Sunnybrook Hospital. So for the next hour, they are going to be discussing pregnancy after loss with us. So during the presentation, we encourage everyone here to please, connect and share with by using the chat feature that can be located at the bottom of your screen there. And for questions or anything like that, we just ask that you save them for after the presentation has completed, so Megan and Lisa can answer your questions. So on that note, I will pass it over to them. Thank you, Lisa and Megan.
Thank you, Colleen. My name's Lisa, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land I'm presenting from this evening, Peterborough, is the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to our First Nations for their care for and their teachings about our earth and our relations, and may we honor those teachings. So thank you for being here and the opportunity to speak with you about pregnancy after loss. If you're joining because you yourself are a lost parent, or someone you love has lost a child, or perhaps you are pregnant following your own loss, while I am sorry to be meeting you on this side of parenthood, I am really glad that you're here. And if you're someone who's joining because you're interested in the topic, then I thank you for coming. By having these conversations openly, I really feel we can destigmatize these experiences and break the silence that often accompanies pregnancy and infant loss. There can be transformative power from storytelling and by making ourselves vulnerable to others. Because of that, I am going to share pieces of my personal story, and I hope that by doing so, it may normalize the grief experience for others and help lead our community towards a greater sense of understanding and support for pregnancy and infant loss. There is much that can be said about pregnancy after loss, layers upon layers of different thoughts and emotions and fears that can surround the current pregnancy, previous pregnancy or pregnancy, and the future. And as everyone's experience will be different, I cannot share my story as this is what pregnancy after loss is, but rather this is what my experience with pregnancy after loss was. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about it tonight. I have had 4 pregnancies, and 2 of those resulted in losses in the first trimester. With my first loss, I was about 6 weeks along, and with my second loss, I was 12 weeks to the day. The day that I lost that second pregnancy was also the same day that I had announced the pregnancy at work, because I thought I was in the clear having made it to the end of that first trimester. There was a fairly significant gap in time between my 2 pregnancy losses. And with my first pregnancy loss, I really didn't process the grief in a healthy way. I didn't explore it, but I really moved past it with the passage of time. So this meant that when I had my second loss, the grief of this newly lost baby was quite compounded with unresolved grief from the previous pregnancy. And this really caught me off guard that I'd had so much residual work to do in relation to that first baby. When I lost the second baby, I had a toddler at home. We had not told too many people that we were pregnant. Our immediate family knew, and my very small place of work knew. But since none of our friends yet knew that we were pregnant, I didn't know how to tell them that, well, there was a baby, but now there isn't. So I didn't talk about it with any of my friends. The people that did know tried in their way to be supportive, but I often experienced their support as hurtful more than helpful. I often felt that their comments in a way negated my right to grieve. So comments like, there must have been something wrong with the baby, so it's better this way, the baby's in a better place, you know you can get pregnant, you'll have another child. So I continued to silently grieve and mull over the loss of the two babies. And then 5 months after that second loss, I became pregnant again. So this pregnancy was a doozy. When I think back to that version of myself, sad and pregnant with a young child at home, I look at her with such love, and I wish that I could wrap that version of myself in a hug. I did go on to have that healthy, successful pregnancy. And so I have 2 healthy living boys, but the pregnancy was a really dark time for me. Sometimes people talk about pregnancies following their losses and they express feeling guilty for feeling happy and excited. I can relate 100% to feeling guilty, but my guilt was not because I was happy. My guilt was because I was so sad. I felt really guilty for Russell, the baby that I was carrying, because I thought my body is his temple, he's inside of me, and I'm so unhappy in my life right now. And I was concerned of the effect that my sadness was going to have on him. I remember feeling like an outsider in terms of pregnant women. And like there's the stereotype of glowing and excited pregnant women, and that was a stark contrast to me, who kept thinking about my babies that had died. When I was pregnant with Russell, while it may have been more normal to have been hyper-focused on thoughts of him, I was dwelling in thoughts and grief for the other babies. It was during this pregnancy that I gave them names. The first baby that I lost, I named PAIL, and the second baby that I lost, I named Macy. I made commemorative jewelry for them. I envisioned them as little tiny humans, visions that I still have in my brain today, as opposed to what I saw them as when I miscarried them at home. And I felt guilty for Russell that I was lost in thoughts of them as opposed to dwelling in thoughts of him. And I can remember sitting in the chair, much like I'm sitting today, and taking my hands and placing them on my belly and thinking of love just coursing through my palms and my fingers and sending that love into Russell, because I felt like I needed to compensate for the dark feeling that I had in relation to my grief. Because of my losses, I was scared that we were going to lose again. So we kept this pregnancy a secret for as long as we could. Even when we made it to that 12-week mark and I knew that my HCG counts were strong, we still kept it a secret. I was 4.5 months pregnant when I couldn't conceal my growing stomach any longer. And so that was when we decided to go ahead and tell our families and friends. And again, in stark contrast to the joy that often will accompany a pregnancy announcement, what I remember vividly about that day is standing in the shower and weeping. And I wept not from relief or from anticipatory joy. I wept because I felt like announcing this new baby would mean the erasing of the previous losses. That in essence, we would be shushing the lost babies under the rug because now there was going to be a real living baby. And I felt like embracing that new coming baby brought us further away from the babies that we'd lost. And I felt really, really alone in that. I remember standing at work with coworkers, 2 good friends who did know about the losses, and one of them commenting on my belly, which had popped. She nonchalantly, with a knowing smile, said, "Second pregnancies." And it hurt. And I said, "It's not my second pregnancy, it's my 4th. And she kind of stammered. She felt uncomfortable. And she said, "Well, you know what I mean." And she's lovely and I adore her. But that comment serves to eliminate the disenfranchised grief that often accompanies pregnancy and infant loss, particularly losses that occur earlier on. That notion that they didn't count because they were lost so early. In the pregnancy and infant loss community, we understand that grief cannot be measured by the gestational age of the baby or the length of the pregnancy, but rather by the bond that had been developed between the parent and the baby. Yet I continue to come up against that wall, against that judgment within our society, that years later I would still carry a torch for those lost babies. It was June 25th, 2012, when I lost that second pregnancy, when I lost Macy. And so every year on June 25th, we release butterflies for the babies. And this practice grew over time so that now a friend and I host a community event in Peterborough in the summer, and we invite other members of the community who have lost babies to come and release butterflies with us. But for people who've not gone through this experience, I've sometimes had to explain myself. People would ask, so you're sad about Macy, you're releasing butterflies for Macy, but if you hadn't lost Macy, then you wouldn't have had Russell. So can't you just look at it that you got Russell and just be glad that you have Russell? Don't you see that if you hadn't lost Macy, that Russell wouldn't be here? Of course I can see that. Of course I understand that equation, but that doesn't mean that I cannot love all of them at the same time. It doesn't mean that I'm not allowed to grieve them and the loss of what could have been while simultaneously bursting with love for my living children. I feel sad for Macy and Kale that they don't get to be here with us, that they don't get to have me tucking them in or tickling them. They don't get to do our token Friday night movie night. And that makes me really sad. And that can also lend itself to grand questions about life itself. Was that it for them? Was that their only shot? Or is their spirit elsewhere now? There is so much that can be said about pregnancy after loss. I didn't know about the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Network until 2 years after I'd lost Macy, and I wish I'd known about PAIL sooner, because I strongly feel that having had a place to speak openly about my experience without feeling judged or misunderstood would have been healthy and helpful for me. I used to be a very private person, which might be surprising as I'm just laying it all out for you. But it's because I navigated that grief journey alone and silently that I'm now passionate about being an open book, so that if I'm sharing with you as I have, it's with the hope that pieces of my story can help others. I came to PAIL following a Google search, and I could not believe that all that time there had been support for me in my community. And so I joined the Peterborough group, learned to be a facilitator, and have been facilitating a mixed loss group in Peterborough for 7 years. And when I had the opportunity to join the PAIL team as an employee, I had the opportunity to provide mentorship to volunteers throughout the province, and then to do awareness projects such as this one, which gives me the opportunity to speak with you. And so I'm now going to share my screen to tell you a little bit more about PAIL Network. Megan, you can see that good? Perfect, thank you. So for those of you who may not have heard of PAIL Network before, or perhaps you've heard of us but you don't know much about us, PAIL Network has been around for almost 30 years, which people sometimes find surprising. PAIL originated as a not-for-profit because there were a group of families in the similar area as one another, but they thought there was nowhere in the community for them to honor this shared experience of loss that they had. And so they formed PAIL together, and as a small not-for-profit, they operated across the province, offering peer-led support and phone support as well. So thanks to Bill 141, which is the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Research and Care Act of 2015, PAIL Network became the ministry-funded and delegated program for Ontario to create awareness, increase awareness and support, and provide education to healthcare providers. Bill 141 is an act to require research to be undertaken and programs to be developed for pregnancy and infant loss, and to proclaim October 15th as Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Day. We became a part of Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center in January of 2017. And what I really want to highlight is that PAIL Network is a provincial program. Sometimes people hear Sunnybrook and they think Toronto or GTA, or that it's a program accessed locally by families in that region. PAIL is a network that is spread out across the province with staff and volunteers living all throughout the province, providing support to bereaved families across all of Ontario. We offer peer-led support at no cost to any family in Ontario. Our peer-led support program means that our facilitators are also bereaved parents, and so they get and understand the baby loss community in a very real and deeply personal way. Our peer support volunteers complete a comprehensive training program when they are onboarded so that they are able to hold space for others without themselves being triggered. Our volunteers offer community circles of support, which are our mixed loss groups. These are in-person groups where people talk and they share their story and hear about the experiences of others. Due to COVID, these groups are currently being held online. We offer loss-specific support as well. Each group is organized based on their type of loss. Groups are running for first trimester loss, second trimester loss, third trimester loss, SIDS, infant neonatal death up to 1 year of life, the medical termination of pregnancy. These groups are offered twice per month in the evening from 8 till 9 p.m. and they're facilitated by volunteers who have also had that same type of loss. Our phone support program is for individuals who would like to receive one-on-one support. We match families with a volunteer based on their experience with loss. So for example, we would connect families who had a termination of a pregnancy with a volunteer who also had a termination of a pregnancy. Our pregnancy after loss group is for individuals who are currently pregnant. We know that when someone is pregnant following a loss, that they are likely still grieving and that they will likely have new fears and anxieties around this new pregnancy in addition to their grief. We know that seeing a pregnant person in group can be triggering for bereaved families, and we know that sometimes pregnant people are not always comfortable being in a group with a growing tummy. And so this online group is for people who are currently pregnant. As PAIL has grown and evolved, so too has this group. We did originally have a curriculum that was used, and the group was run as a 6-week series, but we found that running it as a series meant that sometimes individuals would have to wait a couple of weeks before the next session began, and our goal is always to provide support to families as soon as we can following their request for support. And we also noted that even though we had a curriculum, conversation tended to flow organically. And so for those reasons, we stopped using a curriculum and we stopped running it as a 6-week series. In terms of referrals and how families can access support, this is the landing page of our website, which you would find at pailnetwork.ca. Clearly delineated tabs across the bottom would indicate where families could go to receive support by clicking the box on the left. Referrals can also be made via the phone. And I want to mention too that referrals can be made on behalf of the family. If the family gives permission and doesn't feel up to filling out the request form themselves, somebody can put that request in for them. In addition to our groups, we have literature resources available online for families and professionals with 8 different language options. The image on the left shows you 2 of the books that we have: Miscarriage, Pregnancy, Loss Before 20 Weeks, as well as Pregnancy After Loss, which Megan will discuss at length a bit later on. Some of the other topics are supporting siblings after pregnancy or infant loss, silent birth, infant death, support for grandparents. Families can request a hard copy of a booklet at no cost, or they can view a digital copy of each booklet on our website in the resources for families section. Professionals can order booklets at $1 per booklet. And it's not that PAIL makes any money off of the sale of that booklet, it's just that's what it costs to duplicate them. The image on the right is to assist professionals in guiding you through conversations that you might need to have with bereaved families, such as lactation after loss. You can click the lactation after loss icon and you'll be given information that you can refer to when you're having conversations with families. As our goal is to be present in more and more communities across the province, I did want to mention that we are continually recruiting and onboarding volunteers. There are volunteer opportunities for individuals who have had a loss, and there are also opportunities for individuals who have not had a loss but still wish to support PAIL Network. Our peer support program is for individuals who have had their own personal experience of loss, who are around 2 years post their bereavement date, and they can offer support through our circles of support or a loss-specific support or a one-on-one phone support. If there's somebody who hasn't had a loss themselves yet they would like to support PAIL Network We could receive assistance with distributing some of our materials or supporting events and helping promote pregnancy and infant loss awareness. Just going to end my screen share here. I felt that volunteering with PAIL was something you wanted to hear more about. There is an icon for you on our landing page on the website as well. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about my story and share some information about PAIL Network. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Megan.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for everyone who's joining us tonight, and Colleen for inviting us. And for anybody who's listening after the fact, thank you as well for taking the time. I want to acknowledge that the land that I'm presenting from tonight in Toronto is the treaty territory of the Credit Nation of Mississaugas and ancestral and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, Chippewa, and Huron-Wendat nations. Today it is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and as a settler, I am grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. Like Lisa, I work with PAIL Network. I don't work on the peer support side of PAIL Network. I work with the education team, and so I'm the education coordinator, and I lead a team of people who provide education to professionals around the province. We teach about compassionate care, and I also support some of the development of the resources that Lisa was sharing about. In my other professional role, I work as a registered nurse at a hospital in Toronto at Sunnybrook, and I lead a program called the Subsequent Pregnancy Program. And it's a program that we started in 2015 that is a special care model for families who are pregnant after loss. And so I'm really, really passionate about this topic. It is really near to my heart. It is the majority of the clinical work that I do. And I just want to acknowledge that so much of what I know is because of people like Lisa and other families who share their stories and their experiences and who talk about what's important in pregnancies after loss. And so as a professional, I have learned so much from families, everything I know, essentially. And so I just want to thank those families for giving the information that I'm going to share tonight. I'm going to share my screen. And Lisa, that's okay? Yes, okay, great. I'm going to talk from the professional side of things. So for those of us listening tonight who provide care, services, or support for families who are pregnant after loss. And as we already heard from Lisa, and probably you already know from your own practice, when a family experiences a loss, it has a pervasive impact. And so it's lifelong, and it continues into subsequent pregnancies, the impact of that loss. It impacts the care that families would like to receive. And I hope that you hear from my talk tonight that as a professional, you have an opportunity to make a positive difference in the care that you provide to families during this time and also beyond. We know that if you are a professional who's working with childbearing families or families at any point, that you will probably encounter families who've experienced pregnancy or infant loss, and you will also experience families who are pregnant after loss. And there's some evidence out there that many families, about 50%, become pregnant within a year of their loss and 80% within 18 months. And this has implications sometimes for anniversaries. And as Lisa mentioned, for a lot of families, when you experience a loss, that they decide to become pregnant again shortly after. And this, I think it's just something for us to be mindful of as professionals, that it's often very close to the loss event, the time that they're experiencing this pregnancy. I learned a lot from families sharing about their experiences and what's important to them in pregnancy after loss. And there's also, fortunately, some really good studies out there that are open access, which means you can access them for free. And they really give us a lot of information about what families feel are important. And so I'm going to talk about two of those tonight that I found really helpful in my practice. This was a survey, an international survey that was done in 2016. And they had over 2,700 parents from 40 countries respond, and Canada was included in those countries. They asked families about the type of care that they received and about additional care that they received in their pregnancy after loss and how they perceived how professionals were towards them. So whether or not they received quality and respectful care in that pregnancy. What they found was that parents often had extra antenatal visits and extra ultrasound scans. And so this makes sense, I think, when you're a professional and you think about the fact that when a family experiences a loss, it's devastating for everyone involved, including professionals who are caring for them. And we obviously don't want it to happen again. And so some of the things that we implement are extra scans and extra visits to see families. There was wide variation across geographical locations across those countries. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I think that just speaks to how there isn't actually a standardization of care. There's no standard of care for families. And so often the care that a family receives, it depends on the professional that they see and their experience and understanding about pregnancy after loss. What they also found was that parents rarely had extra emotional support, that many parents felt their care providers didn't always listen to them, didn't spend enough time with them, didn't involve them with decisions or take their concerns seriously. And so families report it and will say to me as well, they have people say, don't worry about that, or I don't know why you're worried about that. Sometimes they're made to feel bad that they came into triage, that maybe they're wasting people's time, and that this was obviously not very supportive for families. They also found that people were more likely to receive extra support if they had a loss that was over 30 weeks in a pregnancy versus before. And Lisa talked about that hierarchy of pregnancy, that there's this perception that if you had an earlier loss, you might not be as impacted by it, which we know not to be true. But this is something that families felt, that if their loss was earlier, it wasn't treated the same way as a later loss. And what they found was that care addressing psychosocial needs was less frequent, even though psychosocial risks in a subsequent pregnancy or pregnancy after loss are more common than the medical risk, for example. They found that about half of parents that responded felt that elements of quality, respectful care were applied consistently, meaning that half of the parents that responded didn't feel that they had respectful care consistently, which I think is an area for improvement, obviously. And then the greatest opportunities for improvement were listening to and spending time with parents, providing information, involving parents with decision making, and taking their concerns seriously. So saying it's really normal that you're worried about that. I'm so glad you came in today. I'm so glad you reached out. You did the right thing by going to triage, encouraging families in the decisions that they make, and then giving them information saying, today I'm confident that the baby is well. And then maybe if you're a primary care provider, you can talk about the ultrasound or the non-stress test, but taking parents' concerns seriously and encouraging them when they reach out for support or for information. A meta-synthesis that was published in 2014 looked at 14 different studies, and they looked at pregnancy after a stillbirth or a neonatal death, and they found that there were sort of three main themes, and I think they highlight what I've just spoken about, that a pregnancy after loss is profoundly altered by a previous loss, that families experience conflicted emotions, and Lisa, I think you spoke about that so wonderfully, that there is anxiety. It is one of the most reported states in a pregnancy after loss, feeling anxious, I'm worried, being isolated. Again, Lisa, as you mentioned, sometimes people, they didn't say the right thing when you had your loss. They didn't say the right thing to you. They said something that was hurtful when you announced your pregnancy. And a lot of times people will avoid, or they'll delay telling people. And so those normal social supports that you receive aren't there. And that families, as a result of that, often they seek additional interactions with care providers, but that those interactions don't necessarily meet their needs. We know that additional emotional and psychosocial support improves the family's experience of their pregnancy and their care. And again, that there's no real consistent evidence base that says this is exactly what everybody should be doing. And what we see is that, and I'm sure you know this from talking with families or from your own experience, that it really varies depending on where you're seen and who you're seen by. There's a lot that is written in the literature about the experience of pregnancy after loss, and we've already talked about those things. Some things to note if you're a professional, that the rates of anxiety and depression are higher in pregnancy after loss and after the birth of a living baby. And so as professionals, if we know that, then we can maybe provide more resources and ask more often how people are doing and coping. Families also experience hope. There's those conflicting emotions. And so a lot of the times in my practice, if a family has a good week or a good day or feels good at a certain point in their pregnancy, we take it as a win and sort of move on from there. But again, there's isolation, there's disappointment in a lot of the times when they reach out for support from professionals. What can we do about this? I think the one thing I want to say is that you don't necessarily have to have a special program for pregnancy after loss to make a difference. And so there's so much evidence that if you make a small change or you implement some of these changes depending on your practice, that it makes a really big impact. And so here are just a few suggestions that I have from my practice. Using a baby's name. Ask a family if they named their baby, and if they did, use it when you talk about that pregnancy or about that baby. Document it when you can in the chart, meaning that other people can also see that, and so families don't necessarily have to repeat themselves. All the time I see, the G2, P1, L0, 38-week stillbirth, and sort of moves on, and it just makes a difference. And I think especially now as families have access to their care and their records, they see what we're writing and read it. It makes a really big difference, and it's a small change that I think is easy to make. Having flexible appointments when possible or more frequent appointments. For some families, they'll appreciate more frequent appointments around the time of their loss. For other people, passing that time of loss will not make them feel reassured at all, and so they might need more frequent appointments for their whole pregnancy. A family might say to you, I'm okay with the routine care, I'll see you in a month, and then they go home and that doesn't feel all that great. And so being able to call back and say, actually, I'd appreciate being seen, that's really helpful. Providing details on how you know that their baby is safe or well is important in the pregnancy. I find this is especially true for families when they can't feel movement consistently. And so they might not know if their baby is well because they don't necessarily feel any different. And postpartum as well, if they have a baby that is alive, sometimes they feel like they might not be able to recognize if there's a problem. They might feel like their body has let them down before. And so anything that you can do to provide information, education, and encouragement is really important. And I think the other thing too is to not provide false reassurance for families. Their baby is well today because they saw you, they had an ultrasound, and this is what you see, but not promising anything, because for a lot of families, they saw a provider and then something went wrong or everything was okay and then it wasn't. So just recognizing that when you as a professional are reassured by something, the family might not feel that exact same level of reassurance. And so we hear this from families that they really like coming into the hospital. The night before, they feel a lot of anxiety, they come here, but then they go home again, and until their next appointment, they might be feeling anxious. Having a dedicated contact person is always really helpful. For a lot of us as professionals, being able to contact us directly is really hard for families, especially in large organizations. And so making that easier, removing those barriers is very helpful. Again, families see us all as part of the same care team. And so, coming here every week for an ultrasound or every few weeks and having somebody say, is this your first pregnancy, or tell me why you're here? It's very hard for families to understand that. And so as much as you can, identify them. If you can't, explain to a family why and give them the language to talk. So for example, our ultrasound department is a big part of the care that we provide. Our systems, unfortunately, don't talk to one another. So the sonographers don't necessarily know that the family is in the subsequent pregnancy program from their system. And so sometimes I talk to families about that, and I say, here's what you would say to them, or identify yourself if you're comfortable. Say, I'm really anxious today because I've experienced a loss, or I had a bad result in an ultrasound and I feel really anxious. And that, unfortunately, it puts the onus on the family, but it also gives the professional a little bit of information about how the family is feeling. Having targeted education is really important. A lot of families will avoid the sort of traditional routes of education. A family might not feel like they belong in a regular prenatal class because families are so happy and they had a bad outcome and they don't know whether or not they're going to be able to talk about that, or they don't want to be around other families that are pregnant. And so taking the time, as much time as you can, to provide that education is really important. I find that a lot of families, they don't necessarily want to jinx it. So they don't want to assume they're bringing their baby home. They don't buy supplies. They don't set up their baby room, especially, or an area for their baby, especially if they did that before and had to remove it. And so talking to families about that, asking them how they're doing, normalizing that. and then asking them after their baby is born about how things are going is really important. Making early connections to community and parenting support, recognizing that for myself as a professional at a hospital, my care for the family ends around 6 weeks postpartum, but that now there's a lifetime of that sort of continues beyond my care, obviously. And so anything that you can do to connect a family to people and resources and professionals that can provide ongoing support in public health and community is important. Thinking about the language that you use with families, and then peer support. Again, it's evidence-based in this population, and fortunately at PAIL Network, we do have a pregnancy after loss group, as Lisa said. I already talked about a few of those things. One thing that I also will mention is using your team is really important. And so I know as professionals, it can be really hard to be the only person who's providing these resources or services, and especially when practices are really busy. And so fortunately for me, I have a really great team that is around me. I work with wonderful social workers, prenatal educators, lactation consultants, mental health workers. We have pediatricians who will speak to our families. And so any time that you can connect to another professional takes a little bit of the workload off of you, and also provides the family with more specific education and resources. So use your team when you can. Another thing that I would say is helpful, and that families say is helpful, is to discuss dates and goals early. And I think about families who experience a loss, let's say before 37 weeks gestation, that for us, if a person has a stillbirth at 32 weeks, we often don't suggest having the baby or inducing labor before that, because we don't want to have a preterm baby. So for a lot of families, they would rather have a preterm baby than have another baby that dies, obviously. And so talking about the idea that you're going to try to go past that stage, and here are the resources, here's how we're going to support you, is really important for families. And so discussing dates and goals early, and saying, obviously, we can adjust as we go. I've met a lot of families who have wanted to know that right at the beginning, and they're newly pregnant, and the professional will say to them, that's too far off, or don't worry about that right now. As much as you can talk about that and support a family, and set the goals together. It's really, really important as a shared decision making. I'm just going to quickly talk about a couple other resources. There is a national clinical practice guideline that was published in 2018. It's through the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada. It is about supporting families in a pregnancy after a stillbirth. I still think all of the points are relevant for other types of loss as well. There was a international consensus meeting that happened in Vancouver. We had a lot of different participating countries. We had bereaved parents, and we had some experts as well in our working groups. And this was a publication that came out. There are 12 recommendations, and if you're a professional, they do talk about medical considerations, screening recommendations, and management. So how often you should do these ultrasounds or other types of antenatal surveillance, the timing of delivery and the mode of delivery. But there are also some psychosocial considerations, all of the same things that we've spoken about tonight, but it's in a really nice guideline if that's part of your work. In terms of Canadian resources for families who've experienced a miscarriage or an earlier loss, there aren't that many. I've really found the Miscarriage Association, which is out of the UK, very helpful. And so obviously it's not all applicable, but there's a lot that is. And so I would encourage you to check it out. They have some really amazing videos about pregnancy after loss. So one where a family finds out they've had a loss in their ultrasound, one where a family has experienced a miscarriage with their GP, another in the ER department, and different resources and guides for professionals. So if this is part of the work that you do, I'd encourage you to check out those resources if you think that would be helpful. This is just a screenshot of one of the videos that they put out. PAIL Network also created a video on pregnancy after loss. We asked families to describe their experience in 3 words. It's a short video. It's about 5 or 6 minutes. It's on our website under the professional section, as well as other resources about pregnancy after loss. And Lisa mentioned the pregnancy after loss booklet that we have for families. As professionals, you can also go on and read the digital copies. If you are a family who is listening tonight, I just wanted to highlight some of the topics in the pregnancy after loss booklet. We talk a little bit about grief and isolation, about sharing your pregnancy news, and questions to ask yourself about your care needs. And so if you're newly pregnant or thinking about a subsequent pregnancy, things that you might want to ask yourself about the different care professionals that you might want to have involved in your care, and how you would decide that. Ways to think about monitoring the pregnancy, attachment, preparing for your baby's arrival, and then choosing a healthcare provider. And there's a really nice summary in there that gives you some questions that you might want to ask your professional, your provider. And obviously this is easier for families who are from a community where they have variety or options, but it might just give you some language and some ideas of things that you could talk about with families. So again, just in conclusion, if you're a professional working with families, you have an opportunity to make a difference, a really positive difference with the care that you provide. And again, making some of those small changes can really be supportive and helpful, and it remains with families long after the news. Again, there's a lot of literature and evidence out there. I'd be happy to share some of that, and you can also find it by doing sort of a simple search. The other thing that I would say, particularly if you're working for an organization where there's competing priorities, one thing that I found has been successful in sort of advocating for this type of care is leveraging existing priorities. And so, you know, a lot of organizations put out their strategic priorities and their quality goals, and a lot of care and support for families experience pregnancy loss and pregnancy after loss you can leverage. So, you know, about quality care and person-centered care and family-centered care, a lot of it ties into that. And so sometimes that's a way to also get buy-in through your organization if you're looking to make a change. And so again, thank you so much for having me and for Lisa. This is a poem that a colleague of mine who's one of our educators at PAIL Network, when she talks about her own experience about pregnancy after loss, she always starts with this poem, which I think is an amazing representation of what some families may experience. So I'm just going to stop my screen share and turn it over to Colleen and Lisa if you have anything else that you'd like to add as well at this time.
All right, Lisa and Megan, thank you both so much for just coming to speak with our hospice community and sharing both like personal and professional expertise. We really appreciate having you. So with the presentation wrapping up, if there's anyone who have any questions regarding pregnancy and infant loss or subsequent pregnancies, please feel free to ask. And yeah, don't be shy. Just you can put it in enter your questions in the chat box or the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. All right, so maybe before the presentation this evening, we did have some people kind of submit some questions. So maybe if it's all right, I'll kind of start off. So one of the questions we had was, what strategies would you take to support someone who has experienced a loss and is pregnant again, but feels that they have kind of lost faith or have kind of lost some trust within the healthcare system due to treatment when they did experience their loss? So what kind of strategies would you do to kind of reinstill like trust in the system?
Megan, does the pregnancy after loss book and the questions about considering your healthcare team, would that be applicable here?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, a family could take a look at the pregnancy after loss book and those questions to ask a provider. And so it does ask, you know, what is your experience in supporting families and what sort of resources and services do you have? I do see this a lot in my practice, and this I think is especially true for families who did reach out when they thought something was wrong, who did go to triage, who did call their healthcare provider and felt like they were brushed off or felt like their needs weren't adequately met, and they experienced a loss, and the next time they get pregnant, they feel like in a lot of ways, I think they may never forgive themselves for not pushing harder, or I should have gone in sooner, or I should have, I should have spoke up more. And so for families, that's very important. I think I agree, Lisa, having families, sort of search around for a professional, which again is easier in larger communities, but finding a professional who will have some flexibility in their care options, I think is really important. Having a professional who is willing to listen to your anger and to listen to your disappointments and understand what went wrong, and then talk about things that can be improved in the future. And I think feeling comfortable with a professional that there's going to be shared decision as much as for family and for professionals. There's nothing better than reading about the experiences of families, I think, and what they ask. It's out there. And so taking the time to do that hopefully will put you in a better position to understand a family that comes in front of you that has been let down by the system and that is looking for different experiences. Lisa, I don't know if you have anything to add from your...
You covered it wonderfully with your expertise. Yes, thanks, Megan.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, so I can ask another one of the questions we received beforehand. One of them is, how would you support somebody who, is excited to be pregnant again, but is also kind of struggling with guilt and remorse, and just how do you help somebody embrace, but also acknowledge the reality of this pregnancy?
Megan, I feel like I want to defer to Megan again. In terms of, I can speak in terms of peer support and those feelings of guilt. As Megan said, that she'll say in physicians' offices, I've been able to say it so many times around a table during peer support meetings that you're not alone in feeling that way. Like, I think it sounds really normal that you're saying that. I've heard so many other families express the same thing that you're feeling, because I feel like that breaks through the isolation piece of it. And guilt, gosh, guilt is something that we hear spoken a lot about in our peer support groups, regardless of the type of loss that it was. Guilt is something that we tend to carry, even though most likely it had nothing to do with anything that we could have done differently. And so I think normalizing that experience is something that I try to do whenever I hear somebody talk about guilt. Megan, do you have something to add for that?
I agree, Lisa. I spend a lot of time normalizing both of those things, and people feel guilty for feeling guilty. And so as much as we can sort of normalize that. From the professional side, there's a shocking number of families who have never spoken to anybody about the circumstances surrounding their loss, who haven't had the reason for their loss investigated, who haven't been able to have a discussion about what happened, and who carry a lot of guilt or thoughts of fault. And so if you're a professional, taking the time to talk about what happened, and as much as possible, repeating the message that it wasn't their fault, can be really, really helpful. And although families might not hear that all the time, I think that's something that can be helpful. Asking families specific questions around what they're feeling bad about or guilty about, and then again reassuring them that it wasn't their fault, or if there was something that could have been done, that they did the best with the information they had at the time. I have families say that they ate too many apples in a pregnancy, or they didn't eat enough apples or fruits. Like, there's all these things, or they drank too much coffee. And so when you open up, I think, space for people to talk about this, it's an opportunity again to say that wasn't it, as much as you can. And I also hear from families that feel like they're doing something wrong, or they're not feeling joy in the pregnancy, and they feel guilt about that. And I think normalizing that, as Lisa said, is really important. I've had families and reassuring families that you're not damaging your baby that you're pregnant with now because you feel sad today. Normalizing that those things are there. I've had families have some comfort with writing letters to their current baby, talking about their pregnancy and the baby that they miss. Normalizing that when you give birth, you might not feel a lot of joy or happiness, or you might, mixed feelings. I think just for me, just creating space to talk about that, and as Lisa said, normalizing it. And I'm sure the peer support piece is really helpful to know that you're not alone, because I think a lot of times families feel they're the only ones who feel this or are going through this, and there's a lot of shame with that.
Well, thank you, Megan. And another question that was was submitted beforehand was somebody was wondering, like, what are some of the biggest improvements you've seen in community and the healthcare system as a whole when it comes to pregnancy and infant loss, and what are some of the improvements you think that we need to still work towards?
One thing I can mention that I think of is I shared that I found PAIL through a Google search. And over time, because I've been facilitating for PAIL for about 7 years now, and I am seeing more frequently that people are being referred to PAIL by their physician, which wasn't as common when I first found PAIL. So I think that PAIL is becoming more known throughout the province, and families are finding out about us sooner. There's still work to be done, and there are still families who aren't aware of resources in their community, but that is one thing that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I agree, Lisa. Lisa, you talked about Bill 141, which was a real, I think, change for us and for Ontario. We're the only province in, we're the only spot in North America that has this type of legislation, and so that was really fortunate. For me, from the professional side, I would love to see more consistent care pathways, particularly for bereavement care, that a family doesn't hear, oh, another family received this at a different hospital and I wish I did too. There's a lot of disparity, I think, depending on where you go and who you see. So I would love to see a change with that. I think there's a lot to be done in prevention as well. And I think the social media awareness and national strategies, if you look at the UK, you look at Australia, they have a lot going on right now that I'm really jealous of. And so I would love to see more work being done there. Our workshops that we teach to professionals, you used to have to pay to attend them, and through Bill 141, we've been able to offer them without a cost, which I think is amazing. But there's still a lot of professionals, I think, who could benefit from more education as well.
Absolutely, I agree. Like everything that you both shared, like I think we have come a long way, but there is still a lot to do, and there's still a lot of I think people feeling nervous about how to kind of approach how to support somebody or families who are going through something like this. What would you both say to say, whether it's like a volunteer or just a friend who's caring for somebody who's going through this, like what are some strategies you feel they could use to kind of help somebody who's going through pregnancy after loss?
I think sometimes people might think it's better to not say something so as to not upset the person who's had the loss. My suggestion would be to acknowledge the loss and match the language that the person who's had a loss is using. And so, I have a dear friend who's had losses, and they weren't very difficult for her because we all react to grief differently, and they didn't impact her the same way they impacted me. And she views her losses as a fetus And I wouldn't refer to my baby as a fetus. And so I think paying attention to the language that people are using when they're talking about their losses and not being afraid to mention them, because I think that at least for me, that's what I struggled so much with, was the notion that my babies didn't count and that nobody else is thinking about them, nobody else is remembering their names. And so, and Megan touched on that too, the importance of using the baby's name if you've heard the name. So I think not being afraid to show up and to acknowledge the loss is a great first step.
Lisa, I agree. And from the professional side, acknowledgement is so important. And so if you're taking a pregnancy history and you hear that a person's had a miscarriage, I often say, I'm so sorry to hear that. And families will often guide, they'll say, thank you, it's still really hard for me, or as Lisa said, it's okay, I feel like I'm doing okay. And then asking, do you feel like that impacts how you feel about the pregnancy right now? Not acknowledging it can be really, really challenging. And the other tip I'll have for professionals is to take the onus off families whenever you can, to reach out, to be the ones that have to order the booklets. If you can have our pamphlets or resources available, make the referral for the family yourself. Professionals can do that through PAIL's website. Anything that you can do to be supportive in that way, I think can go a long way. And a simple, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. I'm sorry to hear about your loss. Families don't forget that they've had a loss. And so I know a lot of professionals are not sure if they should bring it up. And I always encourage families to acknowledge it in some way. And even if a family doesn't want to talk about it, then they might down the road, and then they know that you're a safe place to talk about it because you've brought it up before.
One thing that I'll add to that too is having empathy and some understanding. And if you're not part of the baby loss community, but your friend has had a loss, we say it's not a club you want to be a part of. But once you're part of the club, like, you get it and you have this sense of belonging with one another. But listening to Megan and with Colleen, your question, I'm reminded of individuals in group who say, oh, I was invited to my friend's baby shower. I got a baby shower invitation. And concerns about, like, if I don't go to that baby shower, is there an expiration date on my grief? Am I supposed to be over it now? Am I supposed to be able to attend those events that are triggering? And what I say at the table is, grief changes us, and we aren't the same people that we were before those losses. And it's therefore unfair to hold ourselves to those same expectations. And it is okay to politely decline attending a baby shower or a christening or whatever triggering event that it might be. And if you are on the other end of it and it's your baby shower that the friend isn't attending, to try to have some empathy for that and on an ongoing basis, because there's no timeline, there's no stage at which the grief is just necessarily over.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. So if anyone in the audience would like to ask anything, please feel free. Okay, so I guess before we part ways this evening, what is like a message that you would like to kind of convey to the pregnancy and infant loss communities, particularly those who are experiencing a pregnancy after a loss?
I think my message would be to be gentle and gracious with yourself, and to reach out for support if you feel that you need it. And whether it's through PAIL Network or Ended Beginnings or different organizations across the province, there are networks of people who are there to support you through this journey. And so just to remember that you don't need to to do it alone. I did it alone and I shouldn't have done it alone. And so I think the message is tapping into the network and the support that's available to you.
I agree, Lisa. When you can find a professional who will partner with you and who will listen to your experience and what you need and what's important, and you do what you got to do to make it through the pregnancy, and that's amazing if you can do that with the right support, and as Lisa mentioned, with knowing that you're not alone in your experience.
Oh, thank you both. You're right. It can be very easy to kind of feel like you are alone while going through something like this and forget that there is a community out there, but there absolutely is one out there. So please feel free to PAIL, hospice, even just, friends or fellow community members, just like rely on whoever you feel comfortable to do so, because you're not alone. Okay, so again, thank you, Lisa and Megan, for taking time out of your evening to come and speak with our little community. We very much appreciate it, and everything you shared was just so inspirational and honestly just so informative. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so please join us next month for our 5th installment of the Grief Matters and the Beginnings series, where we will be focusing on a difficult choice, medical termination of a pregnancy. Okay, thank you everyone, and have a good evening.
Bye, take care.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care.